Hi, welcome back to EducateTube.com. My name is Sipsky, your host. In this video, I want to talk about why you should not always purchase the latest, greatest gear, and you should not be listening to us, gear reviewer, telling you what you need to buy. I think each circumstance, especially we don't know your needs, you need to evaluate yourself. I think you need to test the gear yourself, especially your older gear that you have already. You want to make sure that it's worth the investment to get a new gear. How much more is it going to benefit? In fact, some of the information that we pass down to you as a gear reviewers, we may unintentionally give you wrong advice. So let's talk about it right now. All right, before you go out and rush to get your latest, greatest gear, keep this in mind. Does the gear improve what you're doing immensely? Okay, that's the key here, immensely. Does the gear reviewer know your circumstances? Because when they're reviewing the gears, they always talk about the latest technology, but it may not fit your scenario when you're doing, say, filming or photography. So you just keep that in mind when you purchase these technology. Like for example, for me, I'm okay with doing YouTube videos in 1080p. In fact, my computers, my desktop is optimized to edit, to process the 1080p clips very efficiently. I mean, the whole system is set up so smoothly that, I have the video clips, I put it on my timeline, I edit it. It takes me less than half an hour to edit and post-process these videos. Whereas, if it's a 4K videos, it would take me, 4 times the amount because my computer may not be able to handle it. So just keep that in mind when there's a reviewers telling you, oh yeah, 4K is the best or 8K is the best. Well, does your current technology support that? In addition, they'll tell you, you should record your film in log profile. Well, the problem with this is that log profile is great if you have 10-bit 422 or higher. The problem with that is a lot of these cameras, for example, the Sony a6100, a6400, a6600, is pretty expensive, but it can only do 422 8-bit. Now, if you don't have to color grade as much, then that's okay. And if you didn't adjust your lighting properly or you didn't white balance your camera properly, then there is an issue. Even if you do the log profile on your camera, if you haven't done the white balance, you haven't adjusted your lighting, you didn't get the the wide aperture lens to bring in more lights, you didn't adjust your shutter speed to bring more light. So all these condition and factors that you have to account for, even the greatest camera you have may be a mediocre film that you're going to come out as a product. Okay, just keep that in mind, because I think a lot of people think that because they have the camera gears, they're going to create a great content. That is not the case. In fact, over the years, I realized that the Sony a5000 is actually a very good camera, even compared to the latest camera from Sony, this a6100. You can get this aftermarket for around 200 to 250. This one, you can get it around 800. And then you look at the difference. If, for example, if you know how to adjust the camera on this one, you may be able to get a video quality image that's in 1080p comparable to the a6100, depending on how you set it up. That is very important. It's just how well do you know your camera and how well can you do it quickly, and do you have the supporting system like the software on your laptop or desktop that be able to edit and transcode the video fast, right, and efficiently. So these are a very important question that you need to ask yourself. And for another thing I would say, like hard drive space and all these things, it's all very important in deciding whether the gear is for you or not. There's other misnomers which I'm going to tell you right now that you should be aware of, and sometimes we kind of assume a lot of things about you as a beginning photographers or videographers. Okay, so I'll give you 3 points that we may unintentionally misinform you because we don't really know how you're going to film your videos. Okay, so that's very important. Let me talk about the 3 things that you may not know. And this is why it's very important that don't always listen to our advice. Okay? All right, let me give you 3 examples that we might unintentionally give you a wrong information or misinformation because we assume that this is how you film. Okay? So for example, the first information might be that the YouTube video experts may tell you to set your shutter speed at 1/50th. Now for me, actually, all my studio cameras, like I'm filming right now, it's actually set to 1/25th or 1/30th of a second. And the reason for that is if I slow down my shutter speed, I'm allowing the light to come in more, and so it's going to be less noise in the images. It's very important that you got to know your scenario. Okay, so if you're filming in the studio and let's say you don't have as much light, then you want to set the shutter speed at 1/25th and 1/30th, and it was just fine instead of 1/50th. Now, if there's a lot of action or a lot of movement, then you might want to set it to 1/50th. In fact, if it's like you want to show slow motion, then you might want to set it to 1/250th or 1/240th because your frame rate is now at 1/20th, right? Full HD. Okay, so just keep that in mind. And in certain cases, you might want it to be set to 1/8 of a shutter speed because you want to give this impression of dreamlike or when the actor is in these kind of like crazy, more confused scenes, and then you want to set that shutter speed to 1/8, and so you get this a lot of motion blur, looking like the person is kind of confused, right? The actors. So again, it depends, right? It depends on how you want to film your shot. So it's not always 1/50th. In fact, studio 1/25, regular filming as a standard 1/50th, action pack, slow-mo 1/20th or 1/240th, or even 480th of a second, right? So again, all depending on how you're setting up your scene. Number 2, you might heard that you should use log profile when you're filming so you can color grade. Well, that is absolutely not true because if you have like a Sony camera or other camera that is like, say, the Sony a6400, a6300, I believe as well, a65, a6600, where another type of camera that has 8-bit profiled, then color grading using log profile may not always be the best. And the reason is because it's an 8-bit video, and so when you try to color grade, there is a limit on how much you can color grade. Just keep that in mind. Now, if the camera is 10-bit 422 or higher, like maybe it's recording a 12-bit DNG or a RAW file, then yes, maybe you could do that. That's definitely good. But you also have to know how to color grade properly. In fact, even before that, you make sure that you color balance your image properly, right? You need, for example, a color chart here. This is important. You want to do that first before you film your log profile. So make sure you have the color chart to calibrate your white balance. It's very important. And then you make sure you have a lot of lights and have your lens that you need. The particular lens, it might be a zoom lens, maybe it's a wide angle prime lens. You have to look at what type of f-stop you have on that lens. Like you want to open it wide, like f1.4, or you want it to be f8, right, in a very bright scene, something like that. Or you might want to put in a filter for a specific look to it. So you have to make sure you set it all up right, just the way you like it. And then maybe in post, you want to just do a little bit of tweaking, okay? So I would say that color grading should be the last resort, especially when you're doing independent films. You don't want to do it in post and realize, oh, the color grade looks pretty bad because you're filming in 4K 8-bit quality, and then you realize you cannot stretch the grading too much. Okay, just keep in mind, get everything right in camera, almost perfect, the way you want, and the lighting, the mood of that scene, all that. Okay, get it all perfectly, and then think about post editing. Okay, that will be the last resort. And lastly, the third example I want to give to you that I learned from my own personal experience is saying that Sony has the best low light camera of all the brands, especially talking about the APS-C, right? That is not true at all. You have to look into the detail of the videos and you realize that's not the case. I was bought into this and I realized that that's not true until I did my own test. And that's another thing, is you need to test your gear very, very intensively. Okay, so do that before you do a serious filming and gonna publish it, say independent films. Okay, you need to know your gears. Let me give you an example of this one, the third point. So for example, Sony is known, well, that's what the YouTubers telling you, that is one of the best APS-C low light camera. That is not the case for me. Okay, so what happened is, when I test the ISO on this camera, and I set everything, like I'll be comparing this to the Fujifilm, right? I have Fujifilm X-T3 and I'm comparing to the Sony A6100. For the longest time, I was convinced that Sony A6000 series are better low light than my Fujifilm X-T cameras. So I'm comparing now the X-T3 to the A6100. What I found out is that when I do my tests in the low light scenario, so I'm testing the ISO, at around 2000 ISO, Sony is very good, right? But after ISO 2000, I noticed something that I don't know if any of you pick up, okay? I'm sure it's not just this camera, it's not a defect of this camera. But what I noticed is, whether it's filming in HD or 4K, at above ISO 2000, if you look at the edges, I'm talking about low light scenes. So when you look at the edges, let's say a piece of metal, okay, some kind of frame, there is this weird artifacts. It's like almost like an oscillating wave along the edges, and it's impossible to edit. Like, you can't get that out of the image. Okay, so Sony, when it goes above ISO 2000, you'll notice that. I noticed it around 3200, ISO 3200. When I zoom in 4 times, I could see it. It's like this wavy kind of imaging. And in addition to that, there's this very weird color noise. It's like a little speckle of lights that shows up, and it's definitely impossible to edit that out as well. Now, compared to my Fujifilm at ISO 3200, I see that there is definitely noise, but the way the noise it looks more like a film grain look. So I'm okay with that. In fact, if you're doing night scene, a grain-like film look may be okay. And in fact, it may be needed for a certain style of filming. So I find that actually Fujifilm has the best. Now, this is my opinion. You can test the 2 gear out yourself. That Fujifilm ISO is actually better than the Sony one, even though, when you look at on your screen here, it looks like Sony has a better low light capability. But if you actually look at the image in detail, you see all these very weird artifacts that you cannot edit out in post. Definitely not, okay? So I would say, if you're looking for the best low light camera, it's actually not Sony I'm talking about APS-C camera. It is actually Fujifilm X-T3. Now, I haven't tested that on the Panasonic Micro Four Thirds, but I suspect because of the small sensors, it may not be as good. But again, I noticed on my GH4, which I'm filming right now, even there is grain. The grain is very similar to the Fujifilm. It has this like film-like grain, which is acceptable, especially if this is a style that you want for filming. The Sony, however, it looks very digital, so it is not always the best low-light camera that people say it is. It may look like it is, because if you don't pay attention to the details, it looks kind of like it can, take in all these low-light scenario. Not always the case, okay? In fact, I always thought that you could crank this thing all the way to 12,800. I found the hard way that no, the optimal ISO is actually 2000 at f3.5, shutter speed at 1/25. Okay, so this is the optimal studio setting for this camera, the Sony A6100, and for the A5000, I noticed that the ISO is set to around 1000, and it's good. Very minimal background noise, okay, on the A5000. So those are some of the examples of unintentional misinformation. So my conclusion is this: when you're watching YouTube videos and looking at some of these YouTube video gear professionals that's telling you advice, they may not know your background needs, like how you film your videos or what type of style you like. So you need to be aware of that, and it's not always the latest greatest gear. You need to know your gear inside out. For example, as a rule for me, if I can't film with my A5000, then I won't be able to film with my A6100. Okay, that's the rule that I follow. This is why in the past few years I haven't been buying the latest greatest gear, because I realized that by learning more about the camera itself, how to use it properly, how to adjust not just the camera but also the type of lens I need, the lighting system, the sound system, all these things come into play, and then maybe a bit of post-editing. All these come into play, and I realized that it's not always the camera. Even they may convince you that 90% is the camera gears. Is not at all. In fact, I would say maybe maximum 30%. Just keep that in mind, and having gears, you need to know its limits, and you need to know even with an old camera, you can do so much with it. Okay, there's a lot of mod out there on the internet as well. For example, this camera here, the A5000, even though it looks like you can only record to 30 minutes, there is actually a roundabout to change it to unlimited recording. Okay, so these are some of the things that you might not be aware of, some of these older camera that some people were able to modify to make this camera even better than when it came out. All right, so thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll talk to you soon.